Okay, well, welcome to this episode of a Revolution in Education podcast. In this second series of the podcast, we're trying to lift up the stories, if I may be as bold to say, of fellow revolutionaries and trying to do what we can to transform the ecosystem, the education ecosystem we are in. I'm not sure whether we're going to be able to do it. Just having talked with listened to Brandi just prior to this recording, we're in a complete alignment because, as I have said, I feel that the educational ecosystem is really not serving our youth or our communities very well. There needs to be a transformation of how the ecosystem operates. But this is probably going to take a long time.
Mhm.
I personally, and I'm kind of saying this so that you guys can jump off this in a second, introduce yourselves and jump off in a second. Um, you know, I think of this as a civil rights action. This is a civil rights movement, not unlike what we saw in the late 50s into the 60s. And not to say that we are done
Mhm.
even today, but there people rallied around how there was a social injustice,
Mhm.
and it takes and I don't really like using this way, but it creates we needed some alliances. We need some relationships and alliances. We need to go arm in arm on this, which is part of what this whole series is about too, so that people can actually hear go, oh my God, that person in Atlanta, Brandi, I mean, she's awesome. I should connect with her. Or, oh my gosh, that person, Erin, wherever you are, I forget where you are right now.
Minnesota.
You need to where are you?
Minnesota.
Where? Oh yeah, that's right. You are in Minnesota, right? Right. So, but I think that, and I'll say this and I'll shut up finally. Like there was a student of mine in Maryland, and was bemoaning the fact that he saw the K through 6 kids that he was working with just dying in the circumstances they were of school. But I started to tell him, like, there are people who are trying to rethink and revision what school can be, and it blew him out of the water. He had no clue. So this is sort of a social media campaign too, right? It's
Yeah.
like, let's let other people know that, if you feel like your son or daughter is dying, if you feel like you're not serving youth well, if you feel like we're doing a gross disservice to these young men and women,
Yeah.
uh, there are people working on this stuff. So let me stop there. And Erin, why don't you or I have connected only once, I think, or twice in the past, and I loved it, but we haven't reconnected since. So who are you? What are you doing? And say a couple words about the revolution and whether you, in fact, also see it similarly. Do we need a revolution in education?
Yeah. So my name is Aaron Robb, and I am the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at Choice-Filled Lives Network. I'm also the co-founder of Re-Envision Ed, which is now a Choice-Filled Lives Network project. I have been working in education for a little over 20 years, first in international development. I spent a number of years in both Latin America and in South Africa, mostly first on kind of huge USAID projects, and then working on the ground in South Africa, starting up a library and education center in a township there, working with the National Department of Education afterwards in South Africa, and really feeling frustrated. I spent almost a decade in international development, and it turns out that just like here, oftentimes our schooling systems aren't serving the children that are in them, and rarely are they even serving the adults that are in them. It's often feeling very soul crushing for both. I then went to Stanford to do my PhD because I thought somebody has to know how to do this better, and spent a number of years really diving into what we know about learning, about literacy, about second language acquisition, about character development, about socio emotional learning, only really to find that really smart people have thought about all of these things for a very long time, and that we actually have empowering theories, we have empowering programs and practices, and we just largely don't use them. So I ended up thinking, okay, if it's not going to be the new curriculum that saves us in any of these areas, what would it take to fundamentally transform our system so that we could use these things that we already know? And I spent the last few years of my PhD looking into what systems change meant. And I think a little bit to your question of a revolution, I think about it as transformation, thinking about how do we transform the system that we have so that it aligns better with the people we want to be, with the kinds of lives we want to create, with the kinds of communities we want to be in and a part of. And it turns out we know how to do that. It's just not, transformation takes time, it takes effort, and it takes will within that. I now head up I'm going to let Brandi tell all about Choiceful Lives Network, but I am very excited about our ability to work both with clients around strategy and vision and mission aligned organizations, and actually start up our own programs thinking about how we make change directly.
Great, Brandi. Yeah, we haven't met, but I've fallen in love with you and what we were talking about before. So lay it on us. Who are you? What do you do?
So I'm Brandi Bisco Kenner. I actually came to be where I sit now, which is founder and CEO of Choiceful Lives Network, via a very multidisciplinary route. So actually started out my career as a classroom teacher. And I always say that my first year teaching experience was at this African-centered charter school in Detroit, Michigan. And it really spoiled me in terms of what I thought education could and should be for both children and educators, because it was such a loving, solid organization and ecosystem. The children had a solid sense of belonging, identity, and self and purpose that was all being nurtured and flourished by this really solid staff who were all in concert with one another and had really solid mentorship practices in place for new faculty and staff coming in. And there were just all these really neat traditions and rituals that really defined home for these students and teachers. And so when I left that first year teaching placement, I moved to Atlanta to be close to my family. My mom is originally from here, even though I grew up in Oklahoma, which is where my father was from. And so moved to be close to my maternal grandmother. And the first teaching job I got here, I thought, oh, wow, maybe this isn't how schools are everywhere. And so was immediately thrown into a special education placement, even though I had had no prior special education training. My undergraduate degree was elementary education and sociology. So I had had only maybe a handful of special education courses, definitely no practica. And I was just amazed that the district trusted me with these children because I didn't have that skill set. And so I thought to myself, well, I better go back to grad school just so that I can serve my kids. So I ended up enrolling at Georgia State to get a master's in behavior and learning disabilities, and really fell in love with reading disabilities in particular, because at the time I was teaching middle school math and science, and I noticed that reading was really sort of the primary issue that so many kids were having. And so decided to focus on that. Long story short, I ended up teaching for a total of about 5 years, both in special ed and general ed settings. And at the end of that master's coursework, I was recruited into a pre-service teacher preparation program, preparing students for both for special education and early childhood education. And so that was really fun work because I got to supervise a caseload of about 20 teachers per semester. But at the same time, there was an opportunity for me to start delving into research. And that was really what began my journey of recognizing that there is this research to practice gap that exists in our sector. I recognized at that point all of this literature that I'm being exposed to, I did not have access to this as a classroom teacher. And so to Erin's point, we had the empowering theories, we had the empowering interventions and practices, and certainly no one was using them or telling me about them. So long story short, I decided at that point that I was basically going to dedicate my life's work to being engaged in work that would draw research to practice connections. But I didn't know how at that time. And so ended up being pursuing doctoral studies in ed psych and special ed. My research interests changed and I transferred out of Georgia State to Emory to pursue studies in cognition and development. So my doctorate actually ended up being in cognitive and developmental psychology, which I think was really helpful because it allowed me to look at the intersections of practice, but also human development and cognition and how our brain works, as well as like all of the sociocultural factors that are influencing both practice and development. And so my primary focus had been for a very long time language and literacy development, which I really viewed through an equity lens as one of the primary levers that we have control over in our school systems to obliterate inequities. And if we think about the fact that for generations, even for example, in the African American population, it was literally illegal for Black people to learn how to read. You could be killed or slaughtered. And we know that literacy is a sociocultural skill and ability. It's a hardwired skill that has to be taught, and it's passed down from generation to generation, even prior to formal schooling mechanisms. And so that denial of access to me is a prime example in practice of what we mean by inequities and systemic racism. But it's also very promising to me because, to Erin's earlier point, it's one of the areas where we have tons of brain science. We know what to do. We know how the reading brain works. And it's a matter of ensuring that the access to that science is not differentiated by race, ethnicity, and zip code. And so a large portion of my work has been around literacy transformation efforts at scale and really disrupting the cycles of poor pre-service teacher preparation around language and literacy development, but also speaking to how do we shape our ecosystems to be conducive so that that learning brain can thrive and children can really flourish and learn in the first place.
Yeah, so you touched on a number of things. I think I want to like, you can zero in on reading and developing reading competencies or skills and so forth and so on. But then you just talked about ecosystems, which is like a whole other thing, right? It's
That's
like,
right. It's
there's one thing.
To everything.
Well, okay. So let's get. So prior to this recording, you started to talk about how you're trying to engage and work with ecosystems. Talk about So yeah, tell me what's all that? What's that all about? What are you doing?
Yeah, so our organization, Choicefield Lives Network, has two arms. We have an LLC arm, which is where we do all of our social impact strategy work with other vision-aligned organizations. And that might be anyone from philanthropies to nonprofits to school districts and on and on. And then on our nonprofit side, that's our own internal impact strategy mechanism. And so we have our own initiatives and projects that we want to push out at scale to transform systems. And so one of those initiatives is what we're calling the Choicefield Lives Network accreditation in human flourishing, language and literacy, and democracy. And its whole purpose is to shift our thinking and the paradigm around what is success, what is the purpose of school, what should we really be measuring in terms of a successful school or successful students. And so it's an opportunity to build capacity in leaders and educators throughout the sector while also pushing our thinking around what we should be measuring as success in the first place. So there's an entire measurement component around developing the measures that are necessary to take a sample of one's environment or ecosystem and say, okay, yes, we know that children may not be thriving in area X, Y, or Z, but what does that say about the environment around them? What is going on in the ecosystem that we have much more control over than what any other individual child is bringing to the table, that we can shape and form in alignment with learning science, the science all around the social determinants of health, all of the things that we know are necessary to create thriving ecosystems in which children can reach their full potential.
Well, that is a huge lift.
It is.
To say the least. I was going to ask Brandi to get into maybe some examples of what the work looks like. But Erin, do you want to build on that? So you're about systems, transformation, the transformation of systems. This is a big undertaking. From your vantage point, how important is this? And if, as a listener, what does that work look like? What does it take for a transformation of systems?
Yeah, well, I think there are two answers. Two things specifically that we're doing. One is we have to change how we think about what it is even schools are for. It turns out that the first step in transforming systems is to change how we think about what the purpose of that system is, if it's a teleological system, which our schooling system is. It has a purpose in our society and for our individuals. And that's where our work around re-envisioning the purpose of education is. We have a big project called 100 Days of Conversations right now, where we're catalyzing conversations all across the country between educators, families, and students around not just what would you change about school, but what's a good life? What's a thriving community? And then how do we think about the role of school in helping to create those? And through those conversations, we're trying to learn more about how people think about what it is we're really trying to do through school. School is our primary, both learning institution, but also our primary socializing institution. So the kinds of communities we want to create need to be practiced in schools. So one way we think about systems change is, how do we shift our thinking about school from one where it's a competition? Some people get ahead, some people don't. We race to the top, right? And it's primarily about academic learning, to one that is about the practice of being who we want to be, both as individuals and as communities, which is the start. I truly believe, and I know that Brandi shares this, that there are good, hardworking, thoughtful, dedicated people working at every single level of the schooling system, but we largely have them working on the wrong problem, and this causes a lot of issues. And then the second part of what we do is what Brandi's talking about, which is thinking about, okay, what does that literally look like in a school, and how do we help that transformation in practice happen? And part of that is through what we measure, what we value, what we say we're going to hold people accountable for. And right now, what we hold people accountable for is largely test scores. And test scores, it turns out, are not actually directly controllable in any kind of way by educators. What educators have control over are the kinds of relationships they form with their students, the kinds of learning environments they create for their students, and the kinds of experiences they design for their students. And so we're focusing not on what educators actually have the levers to change. If they knew how to change that, they would. But if we shift instead to this thinking about, okay, how do we help people develop the kinds of relationships that lead to healthy development, the kinds of environments that lead to healthy development, the kinds of experiences that lead to the kinds of learning and evolution and transformation in individuals that we know is possible, then we have a real chance at change.
That's incredible. I love it. But now here's the deal. And Brandi, maybe you can give an answer here, and then we'll go back to Erin. What does that work look like? How does that happen?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I've done a lot of transformation work that I kind of hinted at when I was talking about the literacy transformation work that I've spent a good amount of my career involved in. And one of the things that I learned through that work is whether you're focusing on ecosystem or literacy or math, it really doesn't matter. It all starts with that school leader and the supports around the school leader and the systems and processes that are in place. And so a good portion of processes like this start with really what we call, it's kind of like the same thing as a needs assessment, but we like to frame it in more positive terms. So we might say something like a flourishing and growth assessment. And it's basically a way to benchmark where the school currently stands in terms of where the ideal should be. And then from there, you put supports in place. And so it is a huge project because it requires capacity building supports from our organization or other partners to go in and really walk side by side and hand by hand with these leaders and their teams. And it's not just let me meet with you once a month. It's like people on the ground. If we were in person, it would be in person, but virtually now, touching base throughout the week, really helping them benchmark and march toward the goals that they set at individual levels for their individual schools, depending on their student bodies, their parent bodies, their campuses, their program, and their own mission and values. And so that's the first step. And then there's this whole journey of like iterative capacity building and implementing based on that capacity building. So there's everything from revamping schedules to looking at what are the curricular resources that we utilize. Are our instructional methods and practices aligning to what we say our values and mission and belief are? So, for example, do we say we're a whole child school, but we're grounded in a lot of behaviorist practices as opposed to constructivist practices, for example? And so it's really helping them think deeply at that alignment level around where do you stand from a theoretical grounding standpoint, and then how do we ensure that everything you're doing in the building aligns to that. And then there's like the doing, and which is where the facilitation and the coaching comes in, because it's one thing to understand it in your mind and get that background knowledge, but then you have to put it into practice and break old habits. And so through coaching, and I've developed a really robust coaching model that leans on the work of some other folks, but just kind of made it a little more robust, and includes a lot of reflection and iterative feedback cycles so that people are constantly in the process of trying it out, doing it with support, doing it on their own, and then getting that time to reflect and jump back into another iterative cycle. And so that's kind of overall how the transformation happens over time. It takes a lot of dedicated support. And even something as small as scheduling can make the biggest difference to getting started, like ensuring that there's time carved away where teams of teachers, for example, can meet with an instructional leader, or that the whole school can be involved in a professional learning journey together. It's not just a one-time sit and get workshop. And so we do a lot of work on the front end, kind of saying, how do we clean house structurally to create the space for you to go on this learning journey, and then the learning and exploring begins.
So is this actually happening?
It is actually happening, and we're excited to say that as of a few weeks ago, we have partnered with the Georgia Department of Education because they ironically have decided to launch what they're calling whole child certificates for schools. To become certified as whole child schools. And so they have about 5 school districts in the state that have raised their hand and we want to do this. And so they have recently just contracted with us to be their strategy and scale partner in that work. And so it is happening, and we will be using the learnings of the Georgia work to codify our own standards and processes, and generalize them to something that can be scalable and accessible throughout various environments and settings.
Wow, that's amazing. Do you still have to, and I'm not sure this is necessarily true, that it has to be one or the other, right? Like, the reality, I mean, when I was hearing you talk, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm all about that. I like I can imagine the schools that are like that. I know schools like this, but they tend to operate outside the system and
Yeah.
not inside the system,
Mhm.
because the reality is that the expectations in the system are such that it's almost uh, supported or catapulted this
Totally.
other environment that's antithetical to the one that you're talking about. So how do you
Very true.
you have to be in that system where those expectations are still there, whether it's from the local community or the state or the federal government. But now you're saying we're going to do a transformation here, but are you still going to be beholden to the other system, or do you have to have both systems in play? How do you do that?
That's such a good point and such a very, very good question. So I think you're absolutely right. And one of the first things that we are doing in this work is finding those golden nuggets of like the least expected places where you would expect to see this work happening. Prior to founding Choice-Filled Lives Network, I was on FTE at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. And one of the things that we delved into was a deep landscape search of whole child school models across the country. And we looked at independent schools, charter schools, and traditional public schools. And what I think is really important to lean on, to your point, is when you find those traditional public schools in the least expected places that are doing this work and doing it well, and talking to those leaders and learning from how they've been able to circumvent and navigate those barriers that you've mentioned, it's so heartwarming. One school that's worth mentioning is Concourse Village Elementary in Bronx. And they are traditional as they come in terms of
That's
structure.
Alexa Sworden and Alexa
That's
Sworden, right?
right. That's
Alexa
exactly right.
Sworden,
She's
and
an
she's
amazing
work.
leader.
Yeah, and they're doing this RevX project, which I'm hoping to get. Okay, so cool with the Transcend Education. All right, cool.
Exactly. So school models like that are the people that we want to pull into kind of our initial advisory cohort. That would be the first set of Choice-Filled Lives accredited pilot schools to help us shape and codify what is the definition going to be of a Choice-Filled Lives accredited school? What are our standards going to be? And what are the realities around some of the practices and barriers that are required in a traditional setting? Because to your point, when you're outside of that, you have much more autonomy and flexibility. But when we find leaders like that who have been able to figure out how to do it and do it well, it really gives us a lot of hope that it's possible, because then you can't point and say, well, we can't find anyone who's been able to do this in a public setting. And we know that it is possible. And to Erin's point, having met Alexa, it's all about will and where your own value systems lie as a leader. She is one of the most strong and intelligent leaders I think I've met in public education. And she's just been so adamant about what she believes is best for children. And she's unwilling to waver, whether it's the district asking her questions or anyone. And so I think that leadership development piece and really being clear about the profiles of leaders who are able to lead this type of transformational work is really important.
Well, it does seem like leadership is really critical. And in fact, I'm going to kick it over to Erin because I want you to kind of respond to two things. One is, it seems to me that leadership is critical. And of course, I'd love to hear you talk about what kinds of leadership you think is necessary in transformation systems and the transformation of systems. I also want to point out, and I don't know how far to go down this rabbit hole or not, like one of the things I made mention of, and actually this is kind of an interesting point, see where it goes. I talk about this is like a civil rights movement, which I think it is. It's for youth and for community, for communities, right? Then for parents, like I think a lot of parents see their kids dying in these systems, and they're wondering what they can do, and they don't see any way out as well. So they do everything they can to make sure that their kid stays in the system, even though it's doing harm to their kid. But that's another matter. We could debate that. But the reality is, so I may get this completely wrong, right? But so if I won't know how to change my thinking if I don't say it out loud and for others to help me think about this, right? It's sort of like Martin Luther King sort of was a figure that galvanized the civil rights movement, although we actually know that it wasn't just Martin Luther King. There were hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who were taking little actions around the South and across the country to sort of mobilize these efforts. And those were really important. So when I think about the revolution, I think about whether or not there needs to be leadership akin to Martin Luther King, and whatever that way you want to think about that, and others. There were other notable figures at that time. But there's an important part that I wonder about, and this is the part I want you to see if you wanted to chime in here, Aaron, about this, which is you also had Robert F. Kennedy as the Attorney General, right? And I'm not sure how far we could have gotten, to tell you the truth. Not that we're still not working on this, but he inserted himself in lots of ways around the segregation and the other issues and challenges in the South that put it on notice, put people on notice, that put the country on notice that this is an issue and we're not going to stand by it. It kind of makes me think about what Georgia and is maybe saying about the whole child system. But in a short, like, what are the components, when you think about the transformation of systems, what are the components that need to be in play for there, in fact, to be wide-scale transformation?
Yes. So, Chris, there was a lot there.
I know.
There were a couple different levels of questions I heard. I'm going to do my best, and you can tell me if I heard you correctly or interpreted your question correctly. I think one is this question about, again, kind of the different the levers for change and where that needs to be happening, and then the importance of leadership in it. And the other is kind of a question about equity. And then there was a third part kind of about systems and what needs to be in place, is what I heard. And I think kind of coming back to what Brandi was talking about and what you were saying about leadership, and we think a lot about this, that, there is change needs to be happening on at least 3 different levels at any given time, right? The actual practice in schools needs to be changing, but that's facilitated by the leaders in those schools making that possible. I think that there is a kind of leadership that is really important for transformation. I think about the work of Peter Senge with systems thinking and the 5th discipline. I think about Liz Wiseman's work around multipliers, and I think about the New Alpha and Danielle Harlan's work around leadership in these. And I think that there is a philosophy and approach to leadership that makes transformation possible. And they often focus, similar to how good learning happens, right, on the relationships, the culture, and a set of principles that we've been laying out around the process itself. So making sure your process is one of continuous learning, where you as a leader are doing a lot of listening, where people have a chance to set an intention, take an action, and reflect on that loop of intention, action, reflection is important in learning for students. It also, it turns out, is important for learning new things as an adult. And so leaders who are able to lead this kind of transformation take on a certain kind of stance with their team and with their school, and set up processes and to make this kind of transformation possible. And then the third level of that, of course, is policy. And a little bit you were getting to this with Kennedy on the grand scale, but it's also, as we think about like the Georgia Department of Education, and really those have to be, they can't get too far disconnected. The policy, the leadership, and the practice can't get too far disconnected from one another. They have to be somewhat connected. along with.
Well, see how you respond to this. I mean, I think that's a really important point, all of that, right? But I also know that I think, and see how you guys want to respond to this, that sometimes people need to see what I call images of possibility.
Mhm.
Because, so they need to like be able to see and see that this is possible and that other people are doing, and to use as inspiration, but potentially is guidance in terms of what they can do. And you pointed to Alexis Sorden in the Bronx, Brandi. I mean,
Yeah.
that's another really important piece, don't you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a totally important piece. And I think to Erin's point, like the long goal is for all of these pieces to be aligned. But I think you're absolutely right that in the short term, one of the really important pieces of the journey getting there is those who are willing to say, kind of similar to what we're saying about children in individual school environments. We can't control what's going on with the policies around us. What we do have control over is what we do in our buildings right now. And how do I shape an exemplar that's different to show the field, to show the district, to show Washington, whatever it may be. That I do think that's a really critical piece, is having these kind of exemplars who are willing to step outside of the box and kind of create their own rules within the rules and just make it happen.
I think also Lydia Dobbins and Tom Vander Ark wrote that book Better Together, and there's been a lot of talk as of late, the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, around the importance of networks and the power of networks, right? So, for an individual teacher or school leader somewhere in Georgia that says, I'm going to move the school to be an entirely whole child in school and so forth. And, the community is going to be like, yeah, what are you talking about? What, how do you, so there's this notion, I think, of network as being very, very critical, because if you, instead of like you being the leader or the individual teacher or district leader, and say, we're going to do this crazy thing and not do school the way we've been doing school the last 60 years,
Right.
everybody's going to look at you sideways and they're like, oh, well, you're just crazy, so we're going to ignore you, if not kick you out of the system, which is not another small point, by the way. I think that some of the reasons that teachers and administrators and district leaders don't go out of the box too much is because they can get kicked out of the system.
It's so true. There's a lot of fear that's been embedded into the culture of our education system. And a lot of it has to do with the history of, again, like Erin is constantly speaking to the importance of us reevaluating what is the purpose of school in the first place, because that's what drives our theory of change. And that's what's driving how we've been operating all these years. And if we don't readjust from a place where school was formed, for industrialized purposes, but also like literally to form purposeful inequities and divides and stratify our societies. And we haven't yet addressed that core purpose upon which all of our educational institutions were founded. And to some degree, it's almost counterproductive to try to go back and unwind the hands of time and do that, as opposed to just saying, what do we want our purpose to be moving forward, and operate from that lens. And not to say that we ignore the history and how it has impacted and continues to impact so many different populations. And really it impacts everyone as a whole, whether we realize it or not, because we're all inextricably tied to one another in our outcomes and the way our economy works and everything. But at the end of the day, there has to be a positive focus on what do we do now to shift it and make it different, and really start from the place of what is the purpose of school in the first place, and what really does define a choice-filled, purposeful life. And I think you're absolutely right about that network piece as well. It's one of the main reasons why I wanted the word network at the end of our organization, Choice-Filled Lives Network, because it's not about us being the ones to come in and save the day. There's so many duplications of effort happening in the field right now because people aren't talking, and the sum is always greater than any individual part. And there has to be someone or multiple people taking the helm and saying, how do we combine efforts? How do we combine brains, forces, resources, everything to make this change really happen?
Yeah, I love that, Brandi, as you know. And one of the things I think about a lot is, so at Stanford, I TA'd the history of school reform with David Lavery for a number of years for the master's and PhD students at Stanford. And we have about 180 years of school reform. And oftentimes just continue making the same mistakes. It's like we haven't looked back to see what has been tried before to learn from it. We're not standing on the shoulders of giants. We are just in these loops. And I keep thinking about, how do we make new mistakes now? How do we not? We're going to make mistakes as we move forward, but how do we learn from the mistakes that have happened before? It turns out we know a lot about how people learn. It turns out we know a lot about how people change. And how do we put those into practice for making real transformation possible? I think one of the things that you were talking about, Chris, and I heard a lot in what you were saying, Brandi, is this idea of shared vision. And this is true of when we think of Martin Luther King. One of the things we actually just read his Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, his book, which was powerful for our Re-envision Ed book club this month. And there were many people working, and there's a lot of question about whether he should have been, the one iconic figure that we remember. And actually at the end of his life was not very well. He was losing popularity in both the impact circles, which was going a bunch of different directions in terms of the social justice and racial justice movement, and in broader society. I think he had like a 30% approval rating, which of course we don't remember that now, as we're trying to make. But what he did do very well was create shared visions and create future possible selves. And I think of Professor Marcus's work around possible selves for young people, where she has done a lot of research on this ability to imagine a different future self and how important that is. And I think that's true collectively, to your point earlier, Chris, that not just in school transformation, but in our society more broadly, we need to be able to imagine a different possible way of being, a different possible self for us individually and for us collectively. And we need to have a shared vision so everyone can pick up their particular piece. Not any one of us, to the network's point, is going to be doing all of this. Everyone's going to have to pick up their piece to be moving us forward. But if we don't have a shared North Star, a shared vision, then we're just picking up those pieces and scattering, rather than moving collectively in the same direction.
Well, this is quite powerful. I know we got to close out here shortly, so I want to pose this question to both of you, and not that you necessarily have to have the answer, but so I'm imagining I'm a third grade teacher in a rural district. I am a high school biology teacher in a New York City school. I'm a new school leader in a suburb outside of Boston. And then I'm also a district administrator that's been in the same system for 15 years, doing rather well, driving down the car, listening to this podcast. And and then it's like this all sounds great, but like I can't even imagine what is the next step that I could take, because as a third grade teacher, if I start talking about this with my colleagues, I'm done. If I'm a district leader and I start talking about this with the community, I'm done. I'm the district, like I can just see where people are saying, I don't even know how to start. Mm-hmm. I hear you. I love it. But what do I do now?
Well, the first thing in deciding to start is deciding to start. I mean, I know that sounds kind of flippant, but it's true. I have found that often our fear of getting started, no matter whether you're the teacher or the leader or the district administrator, is what gets in the way. And typically, once people make up their minds that this is the direction they want to go in, then they just say, okay, I'm going to start. So then from there, deciding and claiming and like putting the stake in the ground that starting today, I am going to start. Then it's about finding and tapping those networks. We consider ourselves one of those networks. So we would love for people to get in touch with us because, as I mentioned, we are in the process of forming what will be a beginning cohort of schools and organizations that will go along this journey with us. And we're also connected to a lot of other entities and organizations that are doing this work. One of our really close partners is the Forest School and its Institute for Self-Directed Learning. We mentioned we're connected to the Georgia Department of Education and partnering with them. We partner and collaborate with Transcend quite a bit. And so just coming into the fold of networks and having supports around you that are all on the same page, aren't going to look at you like you're crazy and say, what are you talking about? Just getting into the place of having that access to community and supports and networks to have the initial conversations. And then from there, we can help chart the path around what the first step should be, what the second step should be, so that they're not putting their neck out there on a ledge. And we have, the framing and the research and the processes to share for those who want to get started. So that would be my first reaction.
Erin.
Yeah, building off of that a little bit, I agree completely with Brandi. And I think about this idea that we grow in the direction of the questions we ask most persistently. And so if we're asking questions about how do I get my kids to pass the test, or how do I make sure that they sit still in class, we are going to grow in that direction. And it's going to be one of more of the same, mostly. If we're asking questions about how might we ensure that every student in our school has a meaningful relationship with an adult who really knows them as a whole human being, if we're asking questions of what does it take for our community to thrive as a learning community, we're going to end up with growing in a different direction. And I think if you have to take a very first step as an educator or as a leader, it's to listen. When's the last time you really sat down with your students and had a deep conversation about what their experience is, how they're doing, what their life outside of school looks like? When's the last time as a leader you've checked in with your teachers in a deep way? I don't mean a 30-second, how are you? I mean what's going well, what's not going well, what do we need to change to make sure that each of our students is heard and feels valued in our community. So absolutely, to everything Brandi said, asking these questions is the first step. Reach out. We'd be happy to send you any resources we have. And then think about what kinds of questions you're asking and how much you're listening to the people around you that you are in charge of serving.
Well, that is fantastic. I think I would leave it, knowing we have to sign off here. I think this is just like the civil rights movement. People need to connect.
Yeah.
If they see something wrong or feel something's wrong, instead of trying to do battle within your system, maybe the first step you can take is to connect with some other people who are working on this as well and thinking about this well. These alliances are really, really important. Mm-hmm. I know that I've said that people can reach out to me. It sounds like people could reach out to you, Brandi, or to you, Erin.
Absolutely.
We need to align ourselves and find the alliances that will give us the courage maybe to ask those different questions in the circumstances where we feel it's hard to ask those questions.
That's right.
And then go back to that community and say, here's what I'm trying to do, but I need help. Mm-hmm. And to find allies in this work, and to find not just allies, find friendships and comrades and colleagues in the effort. That's the only way we're going to be able to do it. We cannot change the system of education overnight, but we can try to work on the system of education. And if we do it together and we create those alliances, I think we'll have more and more of this happening across our systems and schools and communities. So thank you so much for making us think about this. I will follow up, and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Brandi. So,
Chris,
if anyone wants to reach us, you can go to our website, which is choicefilledlives.org, and all of our email addresses are there, but I'm just Brandi at choicefilledlives.org, and Erin is just Erin at choicefilledlives.org, and I'm Brandi with an I.
And I'd love to, Chris, if you don't mind, make a quick plug for 100 Days of Conversations as a great first step, in the sense of right now, for the first 100 days of the new administration, we have educators, school leaders, district of education officials, parents, who are all hosting conversations that are intergenerational in their community to talk about these bigger, more beautiful questions around good lives, thriving communities, the role of school. And it does not take much of your time. The entire process is all set up. Basically, you just have to find your people, find your time, and you show up with a facilitation guide. But everyone so far has said it's been incredibly powerful and set them up to think of new ways of entering next year. So I'd like to encourage you. The website is 100daysofconversations.org.
Well, maybe it won't be just 100 days of conversation.
It might not be. We're already looking past it, but we are very excited. We're going to get this in front of the new Secretary of Education, what comes out of it. We have a way, to your point earlier, about for analyzing these. I'm a qualitative researcher by training, and so we're looking at how to make sense. So thanks so much, Chris.
Well, thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed it very much. Thank you
so much for having me.
Take care.